Let's not act like people in their 40s are just going to die off tomorrow. These readers potentially do have like 30, 40 more years of collecting and interest in the hobby themselves, but when Marvel and DC try to find this younger audience, they drove them off, and it turns out that younger audience are reading comics. They're not reading DC and Marvel. Phil Boyle of Coliseum of Comics, the chain of comic book shops in Florida, has lit a fire underneath the comic book industry. We're like 3 weeks past his op-ed that he put out, Bounding into Comics. I believe it was also on icfedu.com. Everyone has had to respond to it. Milton Greep did a big Cable We Save Comic Books, and is getting replies from all the major comic book retailers out there with their opinions on there. Brian Hibbs came out. I didn't think he said anything really of note or of interesting. We saw what Brian Higgins had to say, which I thought was interesting, but for all the wrong reasons. He kind of outed himself as a moron. And just today, we got responses from Chuck Rozanski of Mile High Comics, as well as a representative from Big Bang Comics in Dublin, Ireland. All very interesting stuff. Chuck Rozanski is an interesting character. I do not believe, based on where he is, I don't think he has a good idea just how much other retailers are struggling. This is the guy that had like the Mile High collection where they found all these pristine golden age comics, like perfectly preserved, like in a barn or something. And it had like the most expensive issue of Action Comics #1 that's ever been auctioned out, the most valuable one ever, like well over, like we're talking in the multi-million dollars when that thing was finally sold off. And they had all these copies of this amazing comic books. And I believe he's had like 2 of those finds. So this guy is a millionaire, likely quite a few times over, maybe just based off of those finds alone. And obviously he's a very successful comic book retailer. In his response, a lot of it is bragging about himself and talking about how amazing it is, kind of like flopping his dick out and showing everybody that he's the big guy on campus. Most of that I didn't think was very interesting, but he did have some interesting words to say. After 53 years in the comic industry, I feel I have a pretty good handle on the evolution of the direct market. Sadly, what I'm witnessing today is an inexorable disintegration of the highly efficient, non-refundable comic book distribution system that I helped to create so many wonderful decades ago. In some regards, I believe that this trend of declining periodical comic books interest is irreversible, merely reflecting the slow death of our core constituency from the ravages of time. Apparently, all the people interested in DC and Marvel comics are dying off. Now, not all the people that are interested in comic books are dying off. We know that there are actually more comic book readers in America today than there ever have been, but they're not reading traditional American comic books, and they're not really supporting the direct market because manga has filled in all the gaps. They have all the genres. They've got superhero, they got horror, they've got gay romance, they've got just romance, they've got coming of age, they got everything you could ever want. And they've actually kind of partitioned the things off like you would expect with your audiences. And people have really attached themselves to that and found that they can get the stuff they want from manga, which is readily available on digital, which is very easy and cheap to get your hands on. And that is not always the case with the direct market and traditional American publishers like Marvel and DC. And he does have like one really, really good idea that I think would work for probably 95% of comic book retailers in America if they could actually afford it. But like the plan he lets out, I would imagine maybe 10% of comic shops in America could afford to go out there and procure a million comic book collection, curate the entire thing, and then sell them off in bunches based on how much they should be worth while giving people deals, which I do believe probably does drive a lot of revenue in Mile High comic books. But you need so much capital just to get your hands on the inventory itself. And then you need so much storage space to be able to store that many comic books. And then you actually have to have the right people to come in and go through all of them individually, put them in the right spots to where you can find out the perfect price point where it's still a deal, but people are willing to pay for it and stuff like that. It's a great idea. I just don't think most people have the capital, the space, or even like the knowledge and expertise among their employees to pull it off. Obviously, Chuck Rozanski has it, and he talks about how successful that's been for his company. But I just don't think it's actually viable for most comic book shops to take that approach at any type of scale that he is doing, where he's talking about they're having the most successful year in the history of Mile High Comics when it comes to revenue or whatever. He continues, the obvious solution to this aging out dilemma is that we need to have a new generation of readers, collectors to emerge. In my opinion, however, that is highly unlikely to occur. The economics of this inexorable decline are relatively simple to understand. As our baby boomer generation steadily leaves us and our replacement population of new collectors is much smaller, print runs are in steady decline. For the creation of comics to then make economic sense for the publishers, comic prices must rise. With each cover price increase, however, another stratum of potential new customers are priced out of the new comics market. That being the case, I see no rational conclusion but to believe that direct market periodical business is in a death spiral right now, one of which I see no obvious remedy. That is a very grim prognosis on the part of Chuck Rozanski. And sitting up from his ivory tower, I can see where he could come up with this. Yes, that is one of the great reasons of the increase in price among DC and Marvel, which we are seeing a lot of over the last 18 months. Both publishers' average comic book price per issue is almost over $5. In fact, DC was over $5 in January, but they had a lot of #1 issues that were very high priced. It dropped back down to about $4.80 in February 2024 when I did the solicitation analysis. So yes, the prices are going up, and every time you do a price increase, you kill off interest from potential new customers, and you also remove a slice of the existing customers as well. Of course, Marvel and DC are driving customers away with the poor quality of the comic books, and then speculators are finding out that perhaps Naomi isn't the investment that you thought it was. Perhaps Miss Marvel isn't going to be the next big thing to blow up in the MCU, and spending all that money on that debut issue ended up not being a really great investment because a lot of the modern characters that are being introduced are very cookie cutter. They're not very interesting. They don't have great powers. They have no good stories associated with them. So then when Marvel Studios or Warner Brothers decide to do something with them and really try to bring them to a new medium, whether it be video games, comic books, movies, animation, there's nothing really to work with. There's no core of the character. It's not like a Superman or a Batman or a Spider-Man or X-Men where you have all these amazing stories created by really creative people that you can actually mine from and then adapt over. There's really nothing to mine with a lot of these newer characters that a lot of people are investing in these days. And we saw, James Tynion did the thing where he just kept introducing new characters that were basically just carbon copies of existing characters with a new coat of paint on them. And people were throwing out lots of money, and he was able to drive up sales. But it turns out it was all kind of snake oil. And I think a lot of speculators are seeing that as well. And it's time to get back to the core audience. Let's not act like people in their 40s are just going to die off tomorrow. These readers potentially do have like 30, 40 more years of collecting and interest in the hobby themselves. But when Marvel and DC try to find this younger audience, they drove them off. And it turns out that younger audience are reading comics. They're not reading DC and Marvel because they don't go to superhero comic books for gay romance. They don't go to superhero comic books for coming of age stories. They don't go to superhero comic books for witchcraft stories and stuff like that. Now you can have that stuff mixed in because the superhero genre itself is very amenable to adding other types of genres to them. But the main event normally needs to be superheroes, and I think it's drove a lot of people off. And we do know people like these characters, and they like this idea of the superhero, the great American mythology that's been created over the years, and people like that stuff, but Marvel and DC aren't delivering it. But I think Chuck Rozanski is so successful at this point, and he knows he probably doesn't need to sell comic books anymore, that it doesn't really matter to him. So I didn't really, I don't know, man. Is it really dead? Maybe it is. Maybe there's no saving it. I mean, Phil Boyle almost said the exact same thing. If we don't fix it in 2 years, there will be no saving it. Chuck Rozanski is saying there is no saving it at this point. There just are no readers out there, even though people are flocking to manga and they are supporting comic books, but from another country. I don't know. I feel like I'm getting mixed signals from the market. Also, Alan Berebi, director of business development for publisher Big Bang Comics, said, before the direct market, comics shifted gears often. Superheroes would fade out and romance or horror comics took center stage. The direct market and the catering to aging fans have eliminated this, and the stores often run by fans themselves do the same. There are some good ones who adapt, but less than we need. It doesn't mean superheroes don't have a place, but we need true diversity. Diversity of genres like manga does, and like manga, a focus on entertainment and escapism like we did in the past. We are in our long tail economy, and the business needs to reflect that. And we have certainly seen DC Comics specifically have a strategy to go out there and attack other genres outside of superheroes and be very, very, very successful. Unfortunately, they shot themselves in the dick when they wanted to treat things like the Sandman like it was Superman or something like that, to where they were corporate-owned entities rather than creator-owned properties. And they didn't want to give real creator rights to people like Neil Gaiman and Alan Moore and people like that. And they ended up leaving, and obviously Image Comics basically is producing a lot of what maybe a Vertigo Comics would be doing nowadays. But DC and Marvel did kind of put themselves in a box to where they're mainly superheroes, but now they want to also incorporate all these other genres and almost overcome the heroes that they have, rather than creating new characters and new universes to fulfill these other genres that they would like to get into. And I would say, like, right now, as an American comic book reader, we might be, maybe not the golden age of horror comics, but this might be the silver age of horror comics. There are so many good horror comic books out there, but they are overshadowed by a lot of the bigger characters like your Batman, your Superman, X-Men, Spider-Man, all that kind of stuff. But there's a lot of really good horror stuff out there that probably isn't getting its just due for the quality that it is, with the amazing art that it has and the stories that they're telling, because American comics have been solely focused on superheroes for so long. And the direct market certainly has been a big part of that. And he does make a well thought out point right there. I don't know that that has to be the end of the direct market and the periodical business and floppy comics as we know them, but it certainly has been a problem that they can't overcome, because DC and Marvel have been bringing a lot of editors that would rather do anything but superheroes, but they still have to have the superheroes in them, or else they won't be able to publish it, kind of thing. It's actually really strange. He also says the other focus should be on recapturing the younger readers. In general, business-wise, we need more long-term thinking. The publishers, specifically the big two, need to treat the stores and other outlets as key partners and realize the healthier they are and the more there are for increase in discovery, the better they will be long-term. They also need to get rid of exclusive deals, and Diamond Comics distributors needs to allow sub-distributors to minimize the cost of stores. Now, they do need to find a younger audience. They need to go out there and find a way to talk to them. I know a lot of people would really like to see the return of the spinner rack. I hate to break it to you, it's just not feasible. It's never going to happen. There's no way that DC and Marvel can fucking compete with Frito-Lay's for the little stand right by the cash register that is literally there for impulse buys, especially when a Batman comic book at a minimum is $5 now. And a Spider-Man comic book at a minimum is $5. There are very few key characters that people would even recognize that you can get for $4 right now, and $4 is probably too much to have a spinner rack and really be accessible to younger audiences for that price point. Not to mention that overwhelming majority of everything that Marvel and DC produce nowadays are not kid-friendly. There's so many fucking wingdings in goddamn Wonder Woman comic books just because she's cursing the whole time. It's really, really strange. And kids are reading comic books. My kids read comic books. They don't really read DC and Marvel. They read Catboy, they read Dogman, they read Diary of a Wimpy Kid. There's a lot of stuff out there for kids that are catering directly to them, right in that price point where it's not really collectible. Everything's got to be such high quality on the paper and print, even though Marvel is absolutely bad right now. But, the cheaper material means that I can just spend $3 on something, hand it to my kid, and I don't care if they rip it up. I don't want them ripping up my goddamn Batman comic book because it costs too much. And there's just, every time Marvel and DC try to do this, there's another reason it can't work in the direct market. And I think a lot of retailers will agree with me. The way that the economics of new comic books work and the discounts they get on the price, they actually need to sell 2 or 3 Scooby-Doo and Batman Adventure comic books just to make up the sale of one Batman comic book in the direct market because of the discounts and the cover price and all that stuff. When you do try to lower the cover price itself because of the way the model works right now, if you're a comic book retail owner, are you going to be pushing Batman, or are you going to be pushing Batman and Scooby-Doo, where you have to sell 2 or 3 times more of that comic book just to make the same profit on the one? I'm going to be pushing the thing I have the better profit margin on. I'm going to be pushing the book that's going to make my business more healthy and bring in more revenue per sale. So they're not really incentivized to do this. The way to do it really is not through the direct market. The way to capture that young audience, it's through their devices. It's through phones. It's through tablets. It's through digital comic books. That's like the new spinner rack, because you could make comic books very affordable directly that kids and their parents can find pretty easily and curate their own list of what they like, generate their interest in the characters in the universe, and then eventually, they do go to the direct market and go get the original copies of the stuff that they love as they get a little bit older. This is what manga did, and this is why manga blew up. But this is something that Marvel and DC didn't do. And a lot of it was at the behest of the direct market themselves. They thought, well, if you make digital comic books cheaper than physical, we'll go out of business, not realizing that it was really a force multiplier rather than something that was going to inhibit people from actually wanting to go buy the physical comic books themselves, because then they mean something to them. Not only do you have the collectible value to it, the fact that it could be worth something in the future, but it's also something that's personal to you that you've invested yourself into. And then you've got to get, you know, the trades of it, and then you got to get the omnibus, but then you've also got to get like the really, really good hardback cover version of it because it still is your favorite character and all that stuff. And that's what breeds that fandom, is the entry point itself. And they definitely have forsaken children within the American comic book industry for far too long. But I don't know that they're going to be able to recapture that anytime soon, whereas manga has already done that, and they've kind of claimed ownership of entire generations of readers. And certainly Scholastic has done that with their book fairs and all that kind of stuff as well. But the prognosis doesn't look good. Chuck Rozanski is not the only person that has been talking about just how bad things are. The thing that really kicked off this whole discussion where everyone's had to chime in is because Phil Boyle was a little too close to the truth and talked about how comic books are basically on death's doorstep. DC and Marvel needed to fix things in 2 years or less, or it wouldn't ever be fixed. And this is what he had to say. There's also a link in the video description.